Hey everybody, so today we are going to be talking about the multiplier effect as part of fiscal policy. So what are we talking about when we talk about a multiplier effect? Let's start off with a question. Why do cities actually want the Super Bowl in their stadium? So you might initially think about this and it might come to you that, oh, it's going to bring a lot of money to that particular city, right? And so the idea is that the initial change in spending will set off a spending chain that is magnified in the economy. So, Bobby will spend $100 on Jason's product, which might be, a hotel room. Jason now has more income, so he buys $100 of Nancy's product, which might be a bar near the stadium. And Nancy now has more income, so she buys $100 of Tiffany's product, which might be Ubers around the city. So the result is a $300 increase in consumer spending, and that's the multiplier effect. How spending is magnified in the economy, right? So the idea behind the Super Bowl question is that if you get 100,000 extra people in your downtown area spending money for 4 days, you're going to see a significant bump in consumer spending. So, if the government spends $5 million, will aggregate demand increase by the same amount? Well, the answer is no. Aggregate demand will increase by even more than that because every person's spending becomes income for consumers. So, the government spends $5 million. Let's say that it hires a bunch of construction workers and firms to build a road. Well, those construction workers now have income, and they go and spend a certain percentage of their money, and then that money gets spent, and so on and so forth. So consumers will take that money and spend, thus increasing aggregate demand. So what we need to figure out is how much will aggregate demand actually increase? Well, as you can probably guess, it depends on how much of this new income the consumers save. If they save a lot, spending and aggregate demand will increase less. And if they only save a little bit, spending and aggregate demand will increase a lot. So if you think about it, so if they saved 9 out of the $10 of income, 9 out of every $10 of income that they got, spending would not increase that much because they're only spending 10%. But if they spent $9 out of every 10 that they got, aggregate demand would probably increase a lot because 90% of that money would be flowing through the economy. So this is what ends up being called marginal propensity to consume, MPC. And it is basically the definition of how much people consume rather than save when there's a change in income, as in the example of the government spending $5 million in the economy. It's always expressed as a fraction or a decimal, and here is the equation. It's the change in consumption over the change in income. Here are the examples. If you received $100 and you spent $50, what would be your MPC? Well, it would be 0.5. What would happen if you received $100 and spent $80? Well, it would be either 0.8 or more easy, 0.8. If you received $100 and spent $100, it would be 1, right? So this is where economists simplify everything by saying you can only do 2 things with a dollar. You can either consume it, spend it, or save it. And so marginal propensity to save is going to be the exact opposite of the marginal propensity to consume. It's going to be basically the 1 minus MPC. So the definition is how much people save rather than consume when there's a change in income. It is also expressed as a fraction or a decimal, and this time it's the change in savings over the change in income, but more often we just usually subtract it from the MPC. So let's look at an example. If you received 100 and saved 50, it'd be 0.5. If you received 100 and your marginal propensity to consume is 0.7, what is your marginal propensity to save? What do you think? Well, it should be 0.3 because you can only, if you're consuming 70%, then you're saving 30%. So marginal propensity to save is always going to be 1 minus the MPC. And this is very important because we really need to figure out the MPS, not the MPC necessarily. Okay, so let's look at how this works. So let's assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5 for everyone. And remember what that means. That means that for every dollar you get, you're saving 50 cents and you're spending 50 cents. So if you get $100, you're spending 50 and you're saving 50. So assume the Super Bowl comes to town and there's an increase of $100 in Ashley's restaurant. Ashley now has $100 more income. Well, what does she do with it? She saves $50 and she spends $50 at Carl's salon. She goes to get her hair cut. Carl now has $50 more income. He saves $25 and spends $25, right, 50%, at Dan's fruit stand. Dan now has $25 more income. This continues until every single penny is spent or saved. And so the total change in GDP, in this case magnified by consumption, not always, but in this case, is going to be the multiplier times the initial change in spending. So in this case, the initial change in spending was $100 times the multiplier. But wait, we still don't know exactly how to figure out the multiplier. So if the marginal propensity to consume in these examples that we've been giving is 0.5, how much is the multiplier? Well, the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. Or you could look at it another way, 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And so in this case, if the well, here's an example. If the multiplier is 4, how much will an initial increase of $5 in government spending increase the GDP? Well, you can do the simple multiplication, and it would be $20. How much will a decrease of $3 in spending decrease GDP? And again, it will decrease it by $12 because we know this initial equation. So let's practice. So we have the equation, and let's ask some questions. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, what is the multiplier? So in order to figure this out, you need the marginal propensity to save. Well, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, then the marginal propensity to save is 0.1. So what is 1 over 0.1? Well, you can break out your calculator, you can do it in your head, but the spending multiplier is 10, right? So what if the MPC is 0.8? What's the multiplier? So again, if the MPC is 0.8, then the MPS is 0.2, and 1 over 0.2 is going to be 5. What happens if the MPC is 0.5? Well, if the MPC is 0.5, the MPS is also 0.5, and 1 over 0.5 is going to be 2. So the spending multiplier is 2 for question number 3. And the question goes on and says, if consumption increases by $2 million, how much will GDP increase? Well, the multiplier is 2. There's $2 million spent, so GDP should increase by $4 million, right? Question number 4. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0, now what does that mean? If it's 0, it means that they are not consuming anything and they're saving every dollar they get. Well, if investment increases $2 million, then GDP will increase $2 million and there will be no multiplier effect. What's the conclusion? As the marginal propensity to consume falls, the multiplier effect is less. So we actually, when we give people tax breaks, we want that money to be spent. And this is going to have important implications for government spending, for taxes, and who we're giving this money to. So let's look at a scenario. So here's some fiscal policy practice. Let's say that we have, if you look up here, a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. So before we even look at the question, let's figure out the spending multiplier. If the MPC is 0.8, we know that the MPS is 0.2, and 1 over 0.2 is going to be 5. So we right now know that the spending multiplier is 5. Okay? There's going to be a 5 times multiplying effect. So it says Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate the following economy. Okay, what does this look like to you? Does it look like an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap? Well, let's answer some questions. So if you have been paying attention, you know that this is a recessionary gap. This is an economy that's in a recession, and we need to stimulate it in order to get it back to full employment. So, do we need to use contractionary fiscal policy or expansionary fiscal policy? Well, we want to use expansionary fiscal policy. And since this is fiscal policy, there are really just two options. Do you remember what they are? You can pause the video and think about it. The government can only use two fiscal policies. They can either spend or they can manipulate taxes. So you can either, if we're using expansionary fiscal policy, we either need to implement government spending or we need to reduce taxes. And how much is the initial government spending needed to close this gap? Well, here's where the multiplier comes in. What did we say the multiplier was? In this case, we said it was 5, right? So there's a $500 billion recessionary gap. So how much should we spend? Well, if you said $100 billion, you were right. We spend $100 billion, the multiplier effect is 5, so that will close that gap. Okay, and there's the answer, $100 billion. And that will close the gap to there. I'm not sure why that says 81. Really, it should be flipped. Okay, let's try another one. This might be the last one. So here we have an MPC of 0.5 again. Actually, not 0.5 again. The other one wasn't 0.5. So let's figure out the multiplier first. If the MPC is 0.5, the MPS is also 0.5. 1 over 0.5 equals 2. The multiplier is 2. So let's keep that in our back pocket. And we've got to use discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate this economy. So what type of gap is it? Well, it looks like we're to the right of long-run aggregate supply, which is full employment. So this is an inflationary gap. So what kind of policy do we need? We need contractionary policy, right? Again, what are our two options? If you think about it, we could reduce government spending or raise taxes in this case. And then how much do we need to decrease government spending by to close this gap? Well, here's where the multiplier comes in. We need to close a $20 billion gap, and our multiplier is 2. So we need to decrease government spending by $10 billion. Okay? And that's kind of how that works. There's one other thing, which is, this is an important thing to remember. Taxing is different than government spending. Why? Changing taxes has less of an impact when it comes to the multiplier than government spending. So why is this? Okay, let's look. Let's assume for the sake of argument that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, marginal propensity to save is 0.25, and so the multiplier is 4. Well, if the government cuts taxes by 4 million, how much will the consumer spending increase? Well, if you're thinking like the traditional multiplier, you would say 16 million, but it's not 16 million. Why is that? It's because the money has to go through an extra layer of the economy in order to actually get spent. So if the government spends $4 million, it just gets flushed right into the economy and immediately becomes somebody's income. But if you give somebody a tax break, well, they get the tax cut and immediately the marginal propensity to consume kicks in. And the consumers in this case will save $1 million and spend $3 million. So then that $3 million is the amount magnified by the economy, and so you get an increase of $12 million in consumer spending, not 16. Okay? So you can take a look at this and practice this on your own. We're running out of time on the video, but you can experiment with how it has to go through those extra layers of the economy. All right.